friends, good morning to all. Today is our 17th session and let me thank you for participating and enjoying all our previous 16 session. हमें बहुत मज़ा आ जाता है, हर संडे हम आपकी राह देखते हैं कि हर संडे आपको कुछ ना कुछ अलग दे और इसलिए हमें भी बहुत कुछ एनर्जी मिल जाती है। आपके जो चैट में जो कुछ आपके कमेंट आ जाते हैं, फीडबैक आ जाते हैं, हमें बहुत बहुत अच्छा लगता है। तो सभी दर्शकों का मैं बहुत बहुत दिल से आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ। Now, as I mentioned you, today's topic is very very interesting. And what is that? You say that knowing the long last life using with the fossils. And luckily today we have the Dr. Devapriya with us who is going to conduct this session. So I would like to introduce Dr. Devapriya. It's my pleasure basically to introduce Dr. Devapriya Chattopadhyay. Dr. Devapriya has completed her MSc in Applied Geology from the IIT Mumbai in 2004 and PhD in Geological Sciences, especially Paleontology in 2009 from University of the Michigan. Her research area is in how marine organisms respond to their physical and biological environment in the ecological and evolutionary time scale. Additionally, she is also studying the fossil in the field. Let me remind you, she is a field scientist and she is a recipient of the 4 major awardees from the University of the Vienna, Austria and the British Council, UK India Education and Research Initiative. Presently, Dr. Devapriya is an associate professor and chair of Earth and Climate Science department at IISER, Pune. So, I am requesting now Devapriya, please start your session.
Thank you, Ashok, for the kind introduction. Hi all, I am Devapriya. I am a paleontologist and I am presently a faculty member at the Department of Earth and Climate Science at IISER Pune. So today we are going to learn a little bit about what the Earth and Climate Science is, especially focusing on the animal kingdom and how do we know anything about them when they are not around. So if you think about Earth and Climate Science, we have a general interest about the things that are happening around us in the earth and climate, and we try to understand it using principles of physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, and looking at observational patterns in the field and around us. So it is quite different in some cases when it comes to experiments. Think about a classical experiment that you would like to do in, let's say, biology. Let's say your question is that how or whether a bacterial colony changes or grows depending on light. Let's say it's a silly question, but still, let's say that's your question. How do you go about it? You probably develop an experimental setup and you keep some petri dishes, you try to grow the bacterial colony and you expose them at a different intensity of light because you are interested whether changing the light intensity actually changes the growth of the bacteria. And so you are changing the initial condition of the experiment and you are trying to understand what is the outcome and how the outcome is changing. Now, in Earth and Climate Sciences, our questions often involve things that happened over millions of years. And it is not possible to do an experiment involving that time. For example, let's say many of us are curious to know how the Himalayas formed. And let's say my question is, very specifically, if I want to know whether 2 tectonic plates collided and formed the Himalayas over a few million years. Now, how do we approach it? It is not really possible to change the initial condition and finally see what is the outcome because there is no experimental facility at this point where we can really generate the Himalayas of the same scale. Instead, what we try to do, we try to break the question into smaller components. We first start with the field observation. We first start with the Himalayas and try to understand how did it form, what are the patterns that we are observing. And then we try to make smaller questions of smaller scales that we can do in the experimental facility. But a big challenge is to bridge the gap between the experimental scale and finally what is the observational pattern. So in some ways it is slightly different, and that's why it's so much fun to actually break a big question into smaller component, design the experiments. But at the same time, if you ask me to perform an experiment today here, it is going to be difficult because, as I said, that the scales are very different, both the time and the spatial scale, and it is not really easy to do it right here. So I will try to give you a general sense of a particular topic of Earth and Climate Science, which I find fascinating, and hopefully by the end of session you will appreciate some of the aspects of how we do research or how we try to understand a question. So my field of focus is paleontology, which basically means the study of ancient organisms. Paleo means old, and the rest basically means study of organisms. And the first thing where we start from are the fossils. Although you might not be familiar with this term called paleontology or fossils, I'm sure that you have seen enough things that are relevant to this discussion. So let us go to the first slide and let me show you a few pictures. Okay? Now, if you look at these pictures, I'm sure that you have seen these pictures before. And these pictures are taken from popular films. If you see in the left-hand panel, you see this is a shot from the movie Ice Age. It's a cartoon film. If you look at the right-hand panel at the top, you see a clip from Jurassic Park, the latest version. And at the bottom, you see another movie clip from the recent movie called Meg. So these are all part of popular culture. Many of you have seen these movies. Many of you have probably looked at some of the clippings of these movies. Have you ever thought that what else is common among these three pictures? So let me give you a few seconds for you to figure out. Yes, you are correct. None of these animals exist today. None of them you see around living and walking and moving. All of them are extinct. What means that they died long back ago and we do not really have them around. Now my next question is, then how do we know anything about them? How do we know that whether this woolly mammoth actually walked on the earth? How did we know that these dinosaurs actually walked on the earth, killed animals, and they were so big? How did we know these big sharks, the megalodons, were living in the sea? So this brings us to the question of fossils, because all of these information comes from the fossil record. Okay? So in next couple of minutes, we are going to talk something about the fossils and how do we know what we know and how much of it is imagination that goes into the movies. So to start with, fossils, by just the term fossils, it basically means something that's dug up. In fact, historically, people did not really know what fossils were, and they simply called anything that was dug up a fossil. But later, people realized that we should have a proper definition, and by that time, people finally made the definition as the remnant of any animal or their activity, any organism or their activity, as long as it's recorded in the rock, we are calling them fossils. Now, the next question is, how do you get a fossil? So let us take a quick look at a picture. Okay, this is a classic fish fossil. Okay, now if you take a look at this fish fossil, what you will find that it has a skeleton and it has some dark material inside, and the rest of the light colored materials is actually the rock. Now take back this idea a little bit more and think about it just for a second, that we are talking about a living organism, a living creature, a swimming fish. How do you get to make it trapped in a rock? Rock is a solid thing, right? And that is one question which people wondered about for a very long time. They could see that there is a solid fish impression, and they could also see that it's actually part of a solid rock. How do you ensure that a solid gets trapped inside another solid? It's a very simple question, but it bothered people for a very, very long time. So to start with, a very old paleontologist, although they were not called paleontologists, they were primarily called naturalist at that point. He started to think about this problem, and he came up with this idea that at some point of time, the rock that we are seeing today must have been in a situation where it was not solid. It must have turned solid at a later stage, and that's the only way it can go and take the remnant of the fish and eventually solidify. So that was the first step of understanding how the fossils are made. Now we know that fossils are primarily found in a specific type of rock which is called a sedimentary rock. Now if you look at this particular slide, you will see at the very left there is this river which is flowing and it's depositing its sediments. These are clay, sand, and a fish is swimming. In the next panel you are seeing that that particular fish died and it's covered by mud and it's buried. In the final panel at the very right, you are finding that the fish sort of looks like a fossil. So in very simple words, that if you have a live animal, you bury it and then cover it with sediments, then with time, if the sediments becomes really hard, and by the way the sediments becomes harder if it gets pressed, if it suffers through high temperature, pressure, then the space between the sediments decreases and it becomes really, really hard. It no longer becomes mushy like a mud, rather it connects to each of these particles and eventually becomes very, very hard, what we call a rock. But the important part of it is the animal after its death should survive for some time before it goes into this rock building process. How does it happen? It's not so simple. Let's take a thought experiment, okay? Let's look around. I'm sure wherever you are sitting or standing, you can see some creatures around, okay? Maybe you can see a house lizard, or maybe there is a fish in your aquarium. And let's take a moment to think, what happens if unfortunately one of these die? So let's take the example of the fish. So when the fish in your aquarium dies, in the first couple of days you will see that the soft tissues rot. That means they are being attacked by the bacteria, and eventually it will all fall off and you will probably see the skeleton, bare skeleton, and then if you keep it there even though it will stink really bad. If you keep it there for some time, you will find that even the skeletons are disintegrating. And if you keep it there for very long time, let's say a couple of years, probably you will see that there is absolutely nothing. It's all mixed with the sediments, if your aquarium actually has some sand at the bottom, and you don't really find anything. Now the question is it going to be different if you look at the house lizard? Well, probably no. You are still going to see the same thing, that initially it's getting eaten by ants, then it's getting disintegrated, it starts to rot, and eventually you will find the skeletons. Even the skeletons do not survive for very long. Finally, you will probably not find anything that is recognizable as part of the house lizard. Okay? So if this is the common thing, then how come we do find fossils or remnants of old life? How do they escape this initial part where they are being attacked by bacteria or other kinds of scavengers? So somehow they need to get preserved in the very early phase before they are covered by sediments and they finally get into the rock building process. And we are going to think some of the ways where you can really think about how to preserve things. Okay? So let us start to think about those. Let us think about the one place in your house where we are really worried and we come up with different techniques of preservation. Have you thought about it? I'm sure that you are thinking about a chemical lab, but we are not talking about a chemical lab. We are talking about a specific spot in your house. Everybody has that. Any ideas? Okay, I think many of you might have identified it. It's the kitchen. In kitchen, we do use different techniques to preserve things. Okay? If you bring, let's say, a few carrots, and if you keep it aside, probably it's going to rot. But if you see the pickle where the carrots are still there, it might be surviving there for a couple of years and you are still enjoying it. So there are very simple things that we do to preserve organic materials which are quite stunning. So let's start with some of those. So the first thing that we are going to talk about is the refrigeration. Many of you have a fridge at your house, and it's a place where we keep our food. Sometimes when we are hungry at night, we even try to go there and grab some things. But the main utility of the fridge is to keep it for some time. And how does it happen? The primary thing is its temperature. It's cold. When you make something cold, many of the bacteria, they cannot grow properly. And as a result, the initial bacterial hunt doesn't happen. Okay? And that's one of the ways of preserving things. And that's one of the ways where nature preserves things. Okay? So let us take a look at a picture which you might have seen before. Some of you might not have seen. And this is a fantastic example of a natural refrigeration. The picture that you see is a woolly mammoth calf. Okay? It's a baby woolly mammoth, and the name of this woolly mammoth is Luba. Okay? It was found from Russia. Now, unlike the first picture that I showed you of Ice Age, where you have seen a cartoon of a woolly mammoth, this picture is not photoshopped. This picture has not been changed in any way. The person at the right hand side, she is a living kid, and she is touching this Luba, which is obviously dead, but Luba lived 41,000 years ago. So this kid is actually touching a fossil which is very, very old. How did it happen? So as I said, that Luba was found from Russia, and I was quite ecstatic about using this picture because it brings back me memories. When I was in my PhD and I was a student, this expedition was going on, and one of our former professor was involved in this expedition. So we used to hear a lot of interesting anecdotes of this expedition, that how did they find Luba and what was so interesting about Luba. So to give you a quick peek into Luba, Luba was found from Russia, as I said, and she was preserved in ice. Initially, she was covered with a mud blanket and then trapped in ice. How did it happen in nature? Luba, along with many other mammoths, they were crossing a river and they were trapped because the river had mud at the bottom and she was trapped inside. Eventually, she was completely covered by mud, and because of the changes in the temperature, the river was frozen and Luba got trapped in this frozen part of the river which never melted. As a result, it's like a permanent refrigeration for 41,000 years. And it's not very specific to Luba because there are Siberian mammoths and mastodons which have been found like this even in other spots. So preservation by refrigeration, by natural refrigeration, is quite common when it comes to animals which lived in subarctic regions. Just to give you some more interesting facts about Luba, if we can go back to this picture, Luba was a tiny baby mammoth. It was 35 days old, and the age of the mammoth, how old she was in terms of her own age, can be deciphered by the teeth. Okay, you can go through the development of tooth and you can come up with a pretty good estimate of how old the fossils are in terms of their own age. How old are they in terms of our time scale, like 41,000 years old? That comes from the fact that you can really date the surrounding regions by radiocarbon method in this case, and come up with a good age estimate. Now, when people dissected Luba, they found that in its gut there was still milk, undigested milk, and some feces or poop. And it's quite common among elephants to digest poop because that helps them to grow bacterial colony in their gut, which helps them to digest other kinds of food, especially when they are babies. Okay? So all of these information comes from studying Luba, this one fossil, where it's preserved to the point where all these tiny details are preserved in there. And if you look closely at its ears, you will see that part of the ear is not preserved. It's actually chewed off by dogs before it was reported. So the dogs did not really find it problematic to chew on a 41,000-year-old meat. But that's the extent of preservation. Now, coming back, what else do we do in terms of preservation apart from refrigeration? Another technique that we use is when we keep things in a plastic bag and then take out the air out of it. It's generally called shrink wrap. This is another way of preserving things, and it can survive for quite long. A close approximation would be if you keep things in a very tightly sealed pack, let's say a bag of chips, often it can survive quite long compared to if you just keep it outside. And these natural shrink wrap are places or processes where animals can be trapped inside a very thin layer of glue which doesn't allow any air to go inside. Let's take a look at this slide. This is called an amber preservation. I'm sure that you have seen a picture like this in the first Jurassic Park movie, where a mosquito was trapped inside tree sap, and these tree saps have very light, thin constitution, so it covers the entire insect. Eventually it dries up, so it doesn't allow any air to go inside, so the organism, in this case the insect, lives there forever. Extracting DNA from it, that is the part of the imagination. We are still not there yet. The DNA degrades very quickly, so it is not possible at this point, but the insect gets preserved really well in this amber. So this is the natural shrink wrap. In fact, most of the insect history that we know comes from these kind of amber preservation. The final one I'm going to talk about, which constitutes this entire class of fossils, which we called a body fossil or unaltered remain, where you can actually find the soft tissue also, is pickling. So in your kitchen, when you go for pickling, what do? You play with extreme conditions. Either you increase the salt content very much, so that again bacterial colony cannot survive, or you play with the pH, make it extremely acidic, or you put a lot of oil that makes it survive for very long. Again, you don't allow any kind of bacterial growth, or even if the bacterial growth is there, it's not basically making the things rot. It can contribute in some other ways. Now, this is one example that we are going to see in a few minutes, which actually shows the natural pickling. Okay, so again I'll go to this idea of what do we do in pickling. We ensure that there is no bacterial growth, okay, or we are exhausting everything that's there. This particular fossil, it's called Ida. Okay, it's 47 million year old. It is one fossil which represents a primate. Primates are very small mammal organisms. We are primates, and primates are almost defined by the character that we have opposable thumbs. Our thumbs are going on the other side of our fingers. So that's sort of a definition of primates. And Ida is one of the early primates. If you look closely, you will even see some of the hair which is smudged around the edges. And Ida was found in a place in Germany, in a lake sediment. And this lake had a volcanic event which basically contributed to the formation of the lake. But because of the high temperature in the initial phase, the oxygen level was quite low, and whatever oxygen was there was consumed by the initial part where the leaves fell into it and got rotted. It all took up the oxygen. So the bottom part of the lake got quite anoxic. That means there are not much oxygen available there. So there were not many living things that were there. So after this tiny primate died, it fell down and it went into this lake and got deposited at the very bottom of the lake. There are no oxygen, so it did not start to rot. Eventually, it was covered by tiny sediments. Some of them even had qualities which make them very tightly bonded. So there is no way the oxygen can go inside, or even any air can go inside, and got trapped. So it's almost like a cast, but you are making sure that even the soft parts are there and it's not changing. Eventually, the lake dried up, all the sediments got buried, and finally it became a rock, and you have the preservation of this tiny little organism with everything present, starting from its fingers to the tip of the tailbone. Everything is preserved, including the hair on its body. So, as I said that, it's difficult to find development of fossils today, but because Earth actually has a long history, although it's rare, we do find a number of fossils in various cases. And as I said that the development of fossils are a rare incident, but even the natural senses or natural events can lead to the formation of fossils. Now I will show some of the fossils which are relatively more common, where we do not find the soft body, but we do find different kind of preservation. So if we go to the next slide, we will show that this is a cast and mold. So this is when the imprints of hard skeleton gets on the surface of the soft sediments, and they leave an impression of the hard body. Okay, these are very common, and in fact often we prefer these over the very delicate preservation of fossils, simply because we can find a lot of them in terms of its number. Now the next one is a different kind of an impression. If we move to the next slide, this is where the minerals go inside the pore spaces of a tissue. In this case, I am sitting on a tree trunk which is now have become a rock. So all the fine tissues have been replaced by silica. It's common sand, but it has been precipitated out of a silica solution. It happens near the volcanoes, but again it's a natural preservation. And the picture that you see at the right shows that all kinds of tree trunks which are around, all of them have been petrified. Going to the next slide is an example of carbonization. So if we quickly take a look at the table now, and coming back from the slides, if we look at the table, I have some example of the carbonized fossil. So if you follow the arrowed area, you can actually see impression of some plant material right over there and here. So it's something like the formation of coal, but not quite. It happens relatively in lower temperature, where the carbon gets concentrated, retaining the shape of various animals that are trapped. But the other kind of fossil that is often found is the trace fossil, where you do not really find the animal or the impression of the animal. What you find is something about their activity. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll show you that there is a footprint which shows the impression, but it actually shows that how the animal moved. There are other trace fossils also. The person is standing next to a large burrow, something like the burrow that I am holding in my hand. This is a burrow that we made by putting the wax in a crab hole, but the same kind of thing you can also find in fossils, okay, where the sediments filled the holes which animals made and then eventually gets lithified. So these also tell us that exactly how the animals lived. The picture that you see, a snail with a tiny hole, it is not the fossil of the snail that we are interested in, but what we see is something where the tiny hole is created by another snail to eat this snail. So it shows you something about their activity, how they hunt. Okay. Now I'll very quickly show you a few fossils that I have on this table, and probably you can recognize that many of them have these impression. In this case, this is a cast, so you do have the fossil along with its original structure. Okay, and if you follow this one, this is also another fossil with very fine preservation. These all are fossils of things like this, seashells that you find today, but we are talking about the age which is in the tune of 25 million years. So this particular rock we found from Gujarat, and it tells you a 25 million year old sea floor. Exactly how did it look like with all the seashells and other kinds of animals. Okay. So in the last bit, I'll be talking a little bit about something about these trace fossils that I was talking about. Okay. So I'm sure that many of you are interested in dinosaurs. So let's take a look at the picture. This is a skeleton of the dinosaur, and in the left hand panel you can see the dinosaurs of different kinds. Now we are so curious about dinosaurs. People are also interested, how did they move? How fast did they move? So they started to look at their trackways. If you go to the next slide, you will find that there are many dinosaur trackways that you can find. The question that people had, using these trackways, is it possible to look at dinosaur speed, or how do we do it? Now, to start this thing, first we have to understand that when an organism moves, it leaves footprints. Okay? And if there are footprints, then the distance between footprints are pretty good indicator of how fast or how slow they are moving. Okay? So I got a very nice video which shows this in action. So if you can play this video, you will see that there is a little girl walking and running. So the top panel shows that she is walking, the bottom panel shows she is running, and we are looking at her footprints. So let's take a look at her footprints and how it differs when she walks versus when she runs. So if you look at the top panel, you will find that the footprints are much close by when she is walking, but when she is running, the footprint, the stride length as we call it, is much bigger compared to when she is walking. And using this principle, we can actually try to understand how the dinosaurs moved. So if you go to the next slide, you will find that there are different kinds of dinosaurs which leave different kind of footprints. Using that, we move to the next slide. You will find that there is a stride length which tells us something about in a dinosaur whether it's walking or whether it's moving or whether it's running. But because animals are very different and they have different heights, we have to calculate what is the relative stride length, and that we do by dividing stride length by the leg length. Leg length can be calculated by looking at their foot impression. So if we use the relative stride length and if we look at the leg length, we can come up with a measure of relative speed. Okay, so let's say we are measuring all of these things and we are calculating the speed, the relative stride length and we are measuring the speed every time an animal walks or runs, there is a general linear relationship. So all it means, every time I'm looking at the relative stride length from the footprints and I'm plotting it here along with the measured speed. And this is I'm doing by looking at animals that are living today. All kinds of animals. Some of them only run, some of them run intermittently, and some of them walk very slowly. If I put all of them, it comes up like this relationship, and we can probably draw a line through it. So it's a linear relationship. And then next thing that we can do, we can try to calculate the relative stride length from the trackways of a dinosaur, and eventually try to calculate what would be the speed. And as it turns out, if you just look at the relative stride length from the trackways of dinosaur, it actually plots somewhere here, which basically means it's a very, very high speed. In fact, some of the trackways give you a speed of 12 meter per second, which is almost similar to a Olympic medal winner in sprints. Now the question is, did they run like this? Were they so fast? The only problem with this is we are calculating instantaneous speed. Okay, so yes, there are some trackways which are quite long, and it gives us some confidence at least they could continue to run like this for some time. It still has to see the final scrutiny whether they could run at that speed 12 meter per second for hours. If that is the case, probably we missed the animals which were the fastest. But just by looking at the very simple trackways and using this simple principle, we could come up with an idea of how fast and how slow they were. In fact, when it comes to the relative speed, in other sense, when we are comparing different groups of dinosaurs, whether some of them are fast or some of them are slow, we found a very nice relationship with the dinosaurs which we know were carnivores. They were hunters, they were always faster, and the dinosaurs which were big bodied, which were not hunters, were slower. So it sort of gives us a general sense that they were fast and they were slow, although we have doubts in terms of the final number of how fast or how slow they were. I will end this talk with the final last bit of things, that what else do we know from these trackways. So if we can go to the next slide, we will see that there are trackways. And now that you know that these trackways are built when somebody puts their weight and leaves these footprints on the mud, and then the mud quickly dries, retaining the shape. So if you walk after the mud has dried, it will not keep any impression. So these trackways show that whatever trackways were made, they were made instantaneously, or in other words, they were together when they were leaving these impressions. And that tells us that these dinosaurs actually walked in groups, which is very unusual because they are still part of the group that we call lizards. Generally, lizards are not found to be, especially the land lizards, they are not found to be animals which love to be in a group. So this was unusual. And the second unusual fact was that probably you have seen this red marked region which shows smaller footprints. And this is not a single one. There are multiple such trackways where we found smaller footprints. Obviously, the smaller footprints have been related to smaller individual dinosaurs. The interesting part is most of the trackways, whenever there are smaller footprints, they are always in the middle. They are not at the sides. So the conclusion, or at least what we think is the most possible scenario, is they were moving in groups, and when they were moving in groups, if there were smaller individuals, the juveniles, the babies, they were always kept in the middle, not at the sides. The sides are guarded by larger dinosaurs. So I hope that this session gave you a general sense of how we can conclude something about the long lost life using fossil record, and just to give you a sense that paleontologists are people who are interested in long lost life, and to become a paleontologist you can have different trajectories. Some people specialize in biology and eventually become paleontologists. Some people study geology, eventually become paleontologists. But I think one important part that you have to have is a love for the nature. You have to be curious, and you have to be observant, and you have to, at the end, have to love what you are doing, and that is the science that you want to do. Okay. With that, I would like to thank for giving me the opportunity to talk about things that I love and to share the stories with you. And I guess it's time for the questions.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful session talking about different types of fossils, also addressing what we can derive from footprints, something which we would have never thought, and it's an exercise that we can do at home. We did this yesterday with Gargi. And I think people will have fun if they try it at home and try to measure the difference between when you're walking and when you're running, the distance, the stride length which we got, and it's pretty significant, as you could see from the footprints which we had shown in the video. So moving to the next segment of today's session, which is question answer session, we have gotten a bunch of interesting questions about earth sciences. So starting with the first question, it's from Pal. He is in class 8th and he asked, how are volcanoes formed?
Okay, it's a very interesting question. Yes, and it's slightly difficult to answer that in short time too. Volcanoes are features from where the magma comes out. We call it lava when it comes out. Okay. Now, it's not randomly distributed all over the world. There are specific spots where we do find volcanoes, and it is related to plate tectonics. I hope that you are familiar with plate tectonics. So there are plates at the very crustal level of the earth where things are solid, and then you can actually think of an egg as an analogy. The very top shell is the crust. Okay, when you boil the egg, the white part represents something like the mantle, and the very bottom is the core. So the crust is a very, very thin layer. Now this crust is solid. Mantle, unlike many popular beliefs, is also solid. Okay, but the rocks in mantle can melt if the condition changes, and often the condition changes if the pressure changes. So the general principle of development of volcanoes are that somehow part of the rocks of the mantle melts and eventually comes to the crust and basically removes or relieves the molten part of the rock, and that's how the volcanoes are formed. We generally find it in convergent boundaries. That basically means where one plate is going under the other plate, and as they go inside, because of high temperature and they also relieve a lot of water, it starts to melt and then eventually comes back through rupturing the crust and eventually form the volcanoes. There are other mechanisms too, where the crust is forming in the mid-oceanic ridges. That's where we also find volcanoes, or just random places where things are coming out because of a partial melting and finally leaving out the magnetic part on the crust.
Volcanoes are very rare in India. So for the chat, you can mention which is the only volcano which is found in Earth, right? There's only
not
one
Earth.
in India.
In India.
I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
I meant India.
Yes.
And there's just one volcanic active volcano,
Yeah,
which
active
is present.
volcano.
I have to mention active volcano in
Yes.
highlights.
Yes.
So there's just one in India, and you can look it up and tell us in the chat
Yeah.
section.
A quick clue, it's not on the mainland.
Yeah. Yes. So moving to the next question, it's from Lekha. She's in class 9th, and Abhinav, who's in class 7th, and they asked, what is soil and how does soil form?
Okay, soils are interesting because it's one of the other very unique character about the earth where we have true soils. So soils are not just crushed up rock, okay? Just crushed up rock covering the earth's surface is called regolith. But proper soils are regolith mixed with organic material. So unless you have a proper mixture of organic material and crushed up rock, weathered rock, it's not a proper soil, and the soil is covering the earth almost everywhere except for a few spots, and unless we have soils, many of the activities that we find, life activities that we find on the earth wouldn't have been possible. And by that definition, no other planet has proper development of soil because they lack organic activity, at least what we know about the planets at this point.
Okay, that's an interesting definition for soil, because usually in textbooks we learn that it's just broken down rock that we call as soil, but organic material is
Yes.
a major part of it.
And air and water.
And air
So
and water,
it's a breathing space
Right.
that is sitting between the atmosphere and the rock layer.
Right. So moving to the third question, it's from Ved. He's in class 7th, and he asked, why is water present on earth, and how was water formed on the surface of earth?
Okay, so we have to think about it slightly differently, that how did the water form on the earth. So the initial history of the planets are quite similar, at least in the solar system, in the sense that they were a molten mass, and eventually they cooled down and they became solid. The earth is also the same, although there are different events in between. But whatever little we know about the formation of the water on the earth, we understand that initially because of cooling down of the temperature, there are water vapors released by the volcanoes that condensed and they formed the rain, and that contributed to the water budget. Another part of the water budget comes from the comets from outside, which also carries a lot of water, and eventually that contributed too. And I am answering all these questions in terms of liquid water at normal temperature, because if you think about just water as water molecules, there are more water in the mantle and in the inner part of the earth than the surface, because they are part of the mineral structure. Right. So if we are talking about free water that you can drink, that you can dip your fingers, that's the surface water, liquid at normal temperature.
Right.
Okay.
So another interesting question from Om. He's in class 7th, and he asked, how did earth look like billions of years ago?
Okay, so
well, we have to give specific
age, but I can go back billion years ago. So this is a time we call Proterozoic. So all we know about this time was there was liquid water, there was oxygen. The oxygen was not as much as we see today, but there was definitely oxygen, and the life was not of modern standards that we see. Right. It was all marine life, and the organisms were quite different from at least the marine life that we see today, in this sense that they did not have hard skeleton. Okay. So it was all generally soft tissued animals, and they were the main players a billion years ago.
But again, soft-bodied organisms won't be preserved as much as...
Yes, so that's why we have other indicators, sometimes just the impressions, which shows us that there were animals and how did they look like. Some of these rare preservations.
All right.
One thing that's good about that time is because there were not that many animals which can crawl, which can move, which can bite, the initial decomposition was also slow.
Okay.
So things were not attacking other animals. So that was also a reason for their better preservation.
Also, was it not noisy in terms of, since there were not a lot of organisms, so you need not distinguish between them, right? Was that the case? I'm just curious.
Yes, distinguish in the sense that the diversity, if you think about the diversity was much lower.
Right.
It was relatively similar looking organisms, simple organisms, things which are similar to sponges.
Okay.
But yes, that's.
Yeah, we
but
learn in Porifera in textbook.
Yes,
So
the
that's-
Porifera. Yeah.
Yes.
So the groups, I think the life was much less diverse, much slower in general if we compare to the modern day explosive nature of life in terms of their diversity and their movement.
Much less movement. Right. So another interesting question, which is really close to my heart because I worked on it for a little time, but I did, and it's from Fayak. He's in class 9th and asked, why did dinosaur go extinct?
Okay, so it's a very interesting question and thank you for the question. So I'll first start with this definition that the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, and if you ask me what killed the dinosaurs, we do not know, but we know 65 million years ago there were changes that happened in Earth's environment, and we think that it contributed to the extinction of these non-avian dinosaurs. One important environmental change that happened because of a meteorite impact, that at least one set of proof shows that there was a major meteorite impact near Mexico, and it changed the entire environmental condition of the oceans as well as the atmosphere, and that has a cascading effect that affected the ecology, the biology, the water composition changed, the environmental composition changed, it led to changes in the climate. So there was a short term and very long term effect which probably affected them. The second thing that is another major change is there was a major volcanism around this time, and that's called Deccan volcanism, and this is so close to home. If you are taking a trip from Bombay to Pune, you actually pass through these Deccan volcanics. So this is a type of volcanism that happened around 65 million years ago, where the entire part was covered by these volcanic materials, and when a volcano erupts, it also has a major implication on the environment, the climate, and at this point people believe that both of these causes contributed to the overall environmental degradation, which led to the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. The reason I've been saying this non-avian dinosaur is in some sense the birds that we see are type of dinosaurs. They are very closely related. In fact, if you plot the characters of dinosaurs and birds, there is no distinct break. So I would say that there are still some dinosaurs in disguise of the birds. So next time you see a bird, look closely how close it looks like.
Right. So there were these also popular articles which showed how we imagined dinosaurs look like versus, early scientists made a sketch or made those simulations where they thought that dinosaurs would look like these predators which are, coming, or monsters, but they are actually like fluffy dodos which went extinct,
Yes,
right?
yes. So if you look at the skeletons, the dinosaurs in fact look very similar to many of the bird anatomy, and that's why it's so interesting. And this is also a point I think it's worth mentioning. I did not mention so much in my discussion that when we reconstruct something, there are always some pitfalls which we can never bridge unless we get very good fossil record.
Right.
Okay? So even let's say when we try to reconstruct the dinosaurs for a movie, I'm sure that there are parts of things which are imaginary. For example, the color of the dinosaur,
Right.
or how much musculature they have. We can reconstruct up to a point looking at their bones. But I think some people did this exercise where they started reconstructing a hippo just by looking at its bones, and definitely it doesn't look like the real hippo. So there is a boundary where we, we can get some information, but there are still lacking things. So unless we get really preserved, well preserved things, that gap is going to be.
Well, it's always said that your science is as good as your data.
Yes.
So the more data we
Yes.
get, the
Yes.
better we can reconstruct it. So moving to the next question, it's from Arya and Anvi. They are in class 8th and 4th respectively. And their question is, why is oxygen found on Earth and not on other planets? If there is oxygen on other planets, are they habitable? Is that the only definition where you can categorize it as habitable planet?
This is a really difficult question, and I think this is one question that scientists are still working on. Let me try to answer the first question slightly later, that oxygen is not a requirement for life. There are places where organisms live where there are no oxygen. In fact, if we look at Earth's history, there are times where there was almost no free oxygen, but there were organisms. So if we go back in time and we look at the boundary around 2.5 billion years ago, before that there was no free oxygen or very little free oxygen, but there was life. So there was primarily prokaryotic life, but there was life. So the presence of oxygen is not a precondition for life, but the present configuration of the Earth, where we have so much of oxygen, unlike any other planet that we know of, is a result of life. So often we think about life as we have life because the Earth is placed in such a nice position with this nice perfectly fit diameter and all the other conditions. But the way we see the Earth today, many of it happened because of the life. So it's a continuous interaction between the Earth and the life, which modified both the life as well as the Earth.
Right. So for the last question, which is also related to the previous question, it's from Gaurav and Ashil from class 8th and 9th. Why is our planet Earth only the one which has life on it?
Okay, so I think we started with questions where we had pretty good answers to the questions where we really do not have very good answers. So far, as I said, so far that our understanding is the Earth is at the right place at the right time and of the right size. Okay, that impacts how much of the gaseous material is going to stay, how cold it's going to be, how warm it's going to be, and at that particular time what was the sun, how much energy was the planets were getting from the sun at that particular point. So all of these worked favorably for Earth, and I think that's one of the reason why we do have proliferation of life on the Earth in the solar system. We really do not know, because there are, I don't think there are countable number of planets, and our observational power lets us only to up to a few planets to observe. So I think this is going to be a question for next couple of decades and centuries, that whether there is life in other planets. But definitely oxygen is not a precondition for life.
So we started the talk with talking about how ECS or Earth Sciences is different from other disciplines, and it's often confusing for people who have majored in a particular discipline, say physics or chemistry, to understand that if they can have a career opportunity in Earth Sciences, which you have mentioned in the talk that there are multiple overlaps. So could you talk about it a little bit before we end the session?
I think we are really interdisciplinary in the sense that if you look at the composition of our department here, you will find people from physics, people who were engineers,
Right.
people from geology, people
Biology.
from biology. So it is a truly interdisciplinary science, but there are some conventional modes of approaching it. Some people study geology, some people study geophysics, others study physics, but again, at the end of the day, it is about your interest and
Correct.
which mode you are going to take.
Yeah, because even when I worked on my master's thesis, it was a paleontology topic, which was actually to understand dwarfing, which is a biology phenomenon. But what I had to do was to do image analysis and mathematics. So it was a overlap of multiple disciplines. It's truly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary in all senses. So with that, I end the question answer session and I'll hand it over to Ashok sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much Devapriya ma'am and Shraddha for conducting this question answer session, and I hope you like both the sessions. Now the last part of today's session is next Sunday we are coming with some new interesting activity on sound. Now before I would like to mention, if you have any question in your mind, please send your question by using the link which is available in the description box, and please don't forget to subscribe this YouTube channel. Now see you next Sunday on the same time over here. Thank you. Bye bye.